June 8, 1967, the USS Liberty, a US Navy intelligence ship, was drifting off the Egyptian coast when the sky erupted. Israeli fighter jets tore through the calm, unleashing missiles and machine gun fire. On board, smoke, fire, men bleeding out across steel decks, screaming into radios begging for help. And someone was listening, not just command posts nearby, not just in Washington, but thousands of kilometers away, across deserts, across seas. Those screams were being heard in real time from a city high in the Horn of Africa, where America had built one of its most secret Cold War spy bases. It was called Kagnew Station. But Kagnew's job wasn't just to listen, it was to intercept, decode, and surveil. What started as a wartime relay post had quietly become one of America's most critical Cold War outposts. Why there, and how did it become so vital? This is the forgotten story of Kagnew Station and how secret American base found itself at the center of global power struggles. The story of Kagnew Station didn't begin with satellites or secrets. It began with the leftover artifacts of war. In 1943, the US Army quietly took over an old Italian radio post in Asmara. It was called Radio Marina, a dusty corner relic built by Mussolini's forces to beam messages across his East African empire. At the time, Eritrea was under British military administration, and the Americans operated there under its watch. It was just a wartime convenience at first, but then something unexpected happened. The signals coming through weren't just clear, they were crystal. Operators began picking up transmissions from impossibly far away, Northern Europe, South America, even Australia. And the more they listened, the more it became clear. This place wasn't ordinary, it was special. High in the mountains under thin equatorial skies, the air was still and interference was low. The perfect conditions for catching whispers from the edge of the world. So the Americans stayed. And as the world slid into Cold War paranoia, what began as a fluke became a foothold. Because just as the Soviet Union was expanding its influence from Eastern Europe to Asia, the United States was quietly carving out a listening post in the Horn of Africa. But to make it permanent, the US needed a reliable partner on the ground. And they found that in Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. The emperor had emerged as a key US ally in a region fast becoming a Cold War chessboard. Washington needed influence, Selassie needed support. So when by the late 1940s Eritrea's fate was put into question, the emperor lobbied for its unification with Ethiopia. And in 1950, the UN, heavily backed by the US, voted to federate it with Ethiopia, giving Selassie a long-sought corridor to the Red Sea. For Washington, it was the perfect outcome. They doubled down, arming and funding Ethiopia in exchange for deeper military access. And soon, the base deal followed. In 1953, the station got a new name, Kagnew Station, a nod to Ethiopia's elite imperial units which fought in the Korean War. But this was no ordinary post, and Kagnew was no longer just a relay, it had become America's ear to the world. But the kind of signals Kagnew was listening to kept changing. What began as simple military surveillance soon expanded into something far bigger, from intercepting enemy radio to tracking rockets streaking across the sky. By the 1950s and early 60s, Kagnew's reach had grown fast, and it wasn't just theory. Even during crises like the USS Liberty attack, the base was catching signals in real time. Kagnew's power didn't go unnoticed, so nearly every major US intelligence agency dialed in. The NSA, the Navy, even the Defense Communications Agency, all were listening in from this unlikely post in the Horn of Africa. But the Cold War wasn't only being fought on Earth. A new frontier had opened, space, and that changed everything.
Whatever lay in store on Earth, it was a marvelous year in space.
Man had his first great success in space.
In 1965, the US launched a top-secret project, Operation Stonehouse. It was designed to intercept the Soviet Union's most sensitive rocket and satellite data. The plan called for 3 sites around the world, but in the end, all focus and funding went to just one place. Suddenly, Kagnew wasn't just a listening post. It became America's premier deep space intelligence base. It was Kagnew's high elevation, stable weather, and quiet skies that made it ideal. From this vantage point, Kagnew could detect a Soviet missile the moment it broke the atmosphere. But more importantly, it could decode what it was doing. Using a method called telemetry interception, Kagnew captured the live data Soviet rockets were transmitting back home. A stream of information like engine pressure, speed, trajectory, fuel levels. It was like tapping into the rocket's nervous system. Then came its most astonishing feat. In February 1966, Kagnew intercepted transmission from Luna 9, the Soviet spacecraft that had just made the first soft landing on the moon. Those signals were never meant to leave the USSR, but Kagnew caught them live. This kind of intelligence changed the game. American analysts could now estimate the range of Soviet missiles, the number of rocket stages, even the payload sizes by analyzing the intercepted data. It shaped how the US built its own missile systems and how it's prepared to defend against them. But Kagnew's role didn't stop at war planning. It also helped build the peace. During the early 1970s, as Washington and Moscow negotiated the SALT I treaty, Kagnew provided what no human spy could: hard evidence of Soviet missile tests and capabilities, the kind of evidence that made trust possible during arms control talks. The technology behind all this was massive, literally. Operation Stonehouse spread across 2,500 acres, crowned by a 150-foot dish towering over Asmara. It couldn't be hidden, so Washington called it peaceful space communications research. Locals weren't convinced. Some believed it was controlling the weather. The truth was even more remarkable. Kagnew's innovations helped lay the groundwork for the world's first satellite networks. It quietly built the foundation for today's global communication systems. From a wartime relay to a Cold War surveillance hub to a deep space outpost shaping military strategy and arms control, the US called it Kagnew Station. To those in the know, it was the nerve center of the Cold War. But here is the irony. A base built here everything was deaf to the war erupting just beyond its fences. And the closer you look at what Kagnew became, the stranger the story gets. Behind the antennas and the intercepts, Kagnew Station was strangely suburban. While satellites tracked Soviet missiles, American kids played Little League. Cryptologists did night shifts as PTA meetings were held in the daylight. At its peak, nearly 5,000 Americans lived here: service members, families, civilians. To them, Kagnew wasn't a secret outpost, it was home. There was a movie theater, a bowling alley, a golf course, even a racetrack, a hospital, schools, on-base TV, a PX mall. General Westmoreland once called it the most remote station in the US Armed Forces. But inside, it felt like a small Midwestern town. A bubble, tidy, insulated, almost utopian. Outside the wire, however, paradise was burning. By the late 1960s, Eritrea was in open revolt. A full-scale war for independence from Ethiopia, and Kagnew sat right in the middle of it. Through its alliance with Emperor Haile Selassie, the US had poured what is equivalent to billions in today's rate into Ethiopia, arming its military, training officers, installing communications networks. Kagnew was the justification. But the same support helped fuel a brutal campaign against the Eritrean independence movement. In 1967, the Ethiopian army swept through rural Eritrea with scorched earth tactics, burning villages, killing civilians, displacing thousands, and the world barely noticed. Inside Kagnew, operations continued. The dishes turned, the signals flowed, the mission never stopped. But for many Eritreans, the base was no longer just a symbol of foreign power. It was complicit, a silent partner to the regime that had annexed their homeland and was now destroying it. So, in September 1975, fighters from the Eritrean Liberation Front launched a direct attack on one of Kagnew's satellite outposts and kidnapped 4 Americans. The Cold War had just turned hot. Kagnew was no longer just a listening post. It became a target. The kidnapping changed everything. Outside the fences, Eritrea's war for independence was intensifying. What had once been a prized outpost in a stable partner nation was now trapped inside a growing insurgency. And for Washington, Kagnew was starting to look less like an asset and more like a liability. But war wasn't the only pressure. Technology was moving on. By the early 1970s, satellites had begun to outpace even the most powerful antenna farms. What once required acres of equipment and thousands of personnel could now be done from space or from leaner, less vulnerable sites. Then came the cost. Maintaining a giant overseas base, especially one in an active conflict zone, no longer made strategic or financial sense. US focus began shifting elsewhere, to places like Diego Garcia, a remote island base with no civilians, fewer risks, and far less political noise. And then, the final break. 1 year before the September 1975 attack, Emperor Haile Selassie, the man who welcomed the Americans in, was overthrown. His replacement was the Derg, a radical Marxist junta aligned with the Soviet Union. Almost overnight, Kagnew became a relic, a symbol of the old order, and one that no longer fits the politics of a revolutionary Ethiopia. So the Americans left. On April 29, 1977, with little warning, the last trucks rolled out. Doors were locked, equipment was abandoned. And just like that, Kagnew Station, once a centerpiece of American intelligence, disappeared. No headlines, no ceremony, just silence. But Kagnew's story didn't end when the last truck left the gate. The antennas may have rusted, the signals fallen quiet, but its legacy still echoes. For decades, the base stood at the heart of the Cold War, a marvel of engineering, a silent witness to history. It has shaped the choice of empires and treaties. It has tracked rockets and helped build the foundation of modern communication. Yet in the end, it couldn't hear the struggle that was being fought around it. Today, the grounds where Kagnew once stood are still guarded, not by American troops, but by Eritrean war veterans, the same men who once fought to drive it out. The Cold War is long over, the base is quiet, but the story it leaves behind of power, resistance, and the silence that follows still echoes in ways no one could have predicted.